so Nigel Foster is back. How awesome is that? And his partner, Kristen. Yeah, so they're here. So thanks for coming, you folks. Nigel is an Englishman living in Seattle, where you might spot him spinning around in a little red canoe, playing guitar. And he makes sure I point out that that's not at the same time, or enjoying a cup of coffee. Once described by a school teacher as a talented dilettante, he has made a living doing what he enjoys, leading expeditions, instructing kayaking around the world, and designing kayaks and related gear. He's also an author. The places he visits and the people and creatures he encounters inspire his magazine articles and books. His latest book, which he has copies with him for sale, right over here. It's awesome. It's titled Just One More. It casts a humorous look on some of the eccentricities of people who share his passion for guitars, kayaks, and coffee. His talk tonight will explore the same theme from some different angles, so as not to detract from the book. Lucky for us, like I said, he's brought some copies to purchase. So Nigel's requested we save our questions till the end. Folks on Zoom, you can type your questions into the chat and we'll read those at the end during the question and answer session. All right, without further ado, let's welcome Nigel Foster.
But first, I have to thank you all for coming tonight on a nice evening with easy traffic and all that sort of stuff. And thank you for Jim and Patty for setting all this up here at this end, and Elsa for making sure that everybody has had just one more beer. I'm going to try and do a talk that has little overlap with what is in the book, but the book Just One More is very new, and you'll see the cover is actually a burning guitar, and that was an actual burning guitar. It actually wasn't one burning guitar, it was a number of them, and there is a story about that. And the story is a little well, it's in the book, you can read it. Most people collect something. Does anybody here collect anything? Any collectors? How many guitarists are there here? Yay. How many guitars do you have? Multiple, yeah, okay. How many people here drink coffee? Portland, yeah. Okay, so if you drink coffee, how many drink more than one? Okay, yeah, you're all on the right page. So some people collect family photographs, and I collect stories, and I collect stories about the things that I enjoy, and that includes guitars. And so why not write a book about stories about guitars and kayaks and coffee, which are three things that I am actually passionate about. Sport of kayaking began about 100 years before I started. And almost exactly, quite amusingly, sort of John McGregor, this character, and this is, I think, is a self-portrait photograph that he took of himself, a selfie, of his first paddling adventure in 1865. And he brought out a book the following year called 1,000 Miles in a Rob Roy Canoe. And he collected canoes, and the canoes that he collected were a new canoe for each adventure. And he had at least 5, maybe 7 different adventures that he wrote. Those weren't the adventures that he wrote about, but he founded the sport of canoeing in UK as a Scotsman, and also in the United States and Canada and elsewhere. And he's sort of credited with starting the sport of canoeing. But what he used doesn't look like a canoe to me. It looks like a kayak. My first book was in 1989, and it was a beginner's guide to the kayak. But my publisher said to me, you can't call it that. I said, why not? It's about kayaking and it's a beginner's guide. And he said, well, it's canoeing, isn't it? And I said, no, it's kayaking. He said, well, I'm sorry, but as a publisher, I have last say, it's going to be canoeing. And just to sort of humor me, he put Beginner's Guide to the Kayak. I thought that was really great. So my next book, my third book, actually, same publisher, 6 years later, was canoeing. So I now have two books, canoeing and, okay, he's going to call it open canoe technique because he thought that was a little better than calling it canoeing because we already had one called canoeing. And he thought, well, okay, so I get it. We'll rename the other one kayaking. And that's the first time it's sold out of the United Kingdom. As a book, it sold 5,000 copies in the first 6 months and was second print after about 7 months, and it sold really well in UK. It didn't sell at all well overseas until it was retitled Kayaking. So the Rob Roy. This is a Rob Roy, an actual original, paddled by John McGregor. And what makes it a canoe or a kayak? Well, is it sitting low with your legs outstretched, as you always do in a kayak? Like, maybe this was an early sub, but I think it was a kayak. Or is it the deck? Kayaks have decks and canoes don't have decks. Or, so this would be a canoe, no deck, you're sitting in an upright position, you've got a single-bladed paddle. It makes sense, doesn't it? Until you start seeing canoes with decks and kayaks without decks and more kayaks without decks. So we have canoes, and most people sort of imagine a canoe as being something that's got an open top, mostly, sometimes covered over, and you paddle it exclusively with a single-bladed paddle, or a double-bladed paddle, or a pole, or something else, or an engine. And in UK, they call them Canadian canoes, if they want to be proper. Canadian canoes because Canada is in North America and a lot of canoes came from North America. Sort of an origin of it, of the idea of a craft that you paddle with a single-bladed paddle. And kayaks, well, obviously you paddle those with your legs outstretched in front of you, sitting low with a double-bladed paddle. But maybe it's still a kayak if you have a single-bladed paddle, or if you stand on your head, or use a stand up in it. You know, it's kind of one of those vague things that you think, well, is it a skiff? Is it a canoe? Is it a kayak? You shouldn't be too pedantic about it. So McGregor is the reason why in the UK we call kayaks canoes, and why we have a penchant for paddling Canadians, which in the United States has a different meaning. My first paddling experiences were in pedalos, which is a little version of a hand-cranked paddle boat, paddle steamer without the steam. You turn the little cranks and the paddle wheels go round and round and you go around the pond. I got bigger and I was still using these things. I hadn't heard about kayaks in those days or canoes. So 100 years after McGregor's first trip, Mac Foster came with us, complete with Crocs and sunglasses. And I was paddling in a Lathan canvas kayak, which if you look at it on the inside, well, if you look at it in dimensions, it's about exactly the same dimensions as McGregor's kayak from, or canoe, should I say, from 100 years earlier. So the designs hadn't really changed very much in 100 years. So there's a frame on the top with the skin on it in the middle, and some people on a whitewater river doing slalom competition underneath in canvas kayaks. And they're basically a wooden frame, varnished, with a canvas stitched on the outside, and either painted or it's rubberized canvas. And that's what they did everything in. You go down a whitewater river, you stop and you stick a repair over the holes, and you carry on. And these were designed by a man called Percy Blandford. And Percy Blandford lived for 104 years old, and he designed numerous kayaks and canoes and surfboards and all sorts of things. He wrote more than 100 books, and his designs were sold all over the world by their thousands. Really, probably one of the most successful kayak designers ever. They were used for sea kayaking expeditions, used by the National Mountaineering Centre in North Wales. My first kayak was one of his designs. And when I started surfing in my PBK, as they were called, Percy Blandford Kayak, my beach didn't have sand. It had pebbles, and it had a shore break. And inevitably, I was upside down in the shore break. My kayak filled up with water and pebbles. And after a few weeks, I got a lot of them out. But the remainder of the pebbles, the pea-sized ones, were stuck between the canvas and the frames all the way down to both ends. And they burrowed their way out slowly, like parasites emerging from the skin, and added quite a lot of weight. So I thought, well, just one more kayak. I'll get just one more. So I graduated to fiberglass, which actually came in the 1960s into slalom competition. Was the first time that they were allowed in slalom competition. It was in the 1960s. And then, because obviously you need one more, I graduated to colored ones, which I abused and continued to abuse while I developed my repair skills back at home, stitching the things back together again with fiberglass. By the way, if anyone is in need of one more glass of beer, please go over to Elsa and order another glass. I won't be offended if you get up and do that. Apart from the people who are on Zoom, where you're going to have to get it from the fridge. After a while, I thought, well, sea kayaks are probably more fun than slalom kayaks playing around in surf. Or you can go on trips with them. You can load everything, including your kitchen sink, and you can go off on a long trip and never see anybody for weeks on end. It's so totally self-contained and have a lot of fun. Sadly, sea kayaks break too and need fiberglass repairs. So in the 1980s, plastic came on the scene. Rotor-molded plastic kayaks really revolutionized having fun without any damage to yourself. You go bumbling down a whitewater river, and instead of having to avoid the rocks, you just bounce over them. And mostly, kayaks would last okay. You could take them out for rock hopping around the coast like this. You could take them surfing and not worry about anything breaking up. When it rains hard in Wales, you can paddle down the river and paddle down the road until you reach the river. Or you can carry your kayak up into the mountains. Actually, this time we went light. We took all the air out of the airbags to lighten the kayaks so that they weren't so heavy to carry up the hill. And then we ran the little streams coming down out of the mountains until they met the rivers. And then we'd carry on down the rivers until we met the sea. But even plastic isn't invulnerable. It does bend sometimes. So there's always an opportunity for just one more kayak. This guy here, he's a surfer, and this is in a tide race in North Wales, and we got him out there to have some fun in some waves that weren't on the beach. And that's his paddle up in the top there. You can see the little splash of colour. His name was Dennis Ball, and he was the national surf kayaking coach for the British Canoe Union, which meant he organised competitions in surf kayaking And when I was a teenager, I used to do surf kayak competition in southwest of England. And Dennis was one of the people who used to organize those. And Dennis was kind of a popular guy. The girls liked him. They hung around on him, on his arms, about 14 of them at a time. This is in my surf kayaking technique book with his custom built wave ski, which is what he enjoyed paddling more than anything. Mostly people surfed in surf kayaks, something like this with fins underneath, and the fins kept the tail end from spinning out on steep waves when you were doing maneuvers. And the surf competitions were mostly in the old slalom kayaks, like the ones in the early pictures. And you can see this trailer is loaded up with old slalom kayaks. Nowadays, we call them whitewater kayaks, but they're all to the dimensions for slalom competition, for an international slalom competition. Nowadays, that class of surf competition would be called the international class. And the other was the surf kayaking class. You can see about three or four surf kayaks there tucked in amongst the others and on the roof of the van. So in the competition, what happens is you get a heat. Each of the competitors is sent out in small groups onto the water, and each group chooses their waves. They pick a good wave and they ride it, and they do all the maneuvers that they can, keeping as close to the break as they can. And they're marked on their style, their positioning on the wave, and the maneuvers that they do. And it's pretty difficult to judge them. So you have to have one judge spotting each competitor. Now, Dennis was experienced in this. He was the national surf kayaking coach. So Dennis was there at a surf competition. He'd just come off the water from his heat, and he got to judge the next one, and he needed a pee. And the restrooms are way up the beach, way up at the top, a long way. So he didn't have time to go up there and back. So he's standing there and he's got his clipboard in his hand and he's judging. And the next event after the one that he was judging was one that, again, he was in. So he, again, wouldn't have time to get up there and back. So what do you do? He thought about it and he said, well, maybe I'll pee in my boat. But it's not very easy to pee in your boat when you're out there in the surf. He didn't want to pee in his boat anyway. And he looked around and he's got quite a crowd standing around him and watching him marking. And he's got his mark sheet and his clipboard. And he's watching people out there on the waves. And thinks, well, I'll just pee. I've got my wetsuit on. Just pee now and it'll go in the sand and nobody will notice. So he's standing there, judging. Oh, that's a good move. Tick. Yeah, positioning's not so good, but I'll give him a 1 mark for that instead of 3. And he's, that's better. And he looks around and nobody's looking at him. They're all looking out at the surf. And he glances down and he realizes that the cuff of his wetsuit leggings is tucked into his boot. And there's this big bulge down there where his pee has gathered at the bottom of his leg. So he's looking around thinking, well, let's try and push this out. And he's trying to squeeze it out without anybody noticing. So anyway, that's the story that he told me about his judging down in Cornwall on surf competitions, where usually you're standing on the beach just watching what's going on and then going out and doing your competition and coming back in again and finding out what your score is and whether you've got another event coming up. So how many kayaks do we need? Has anyone got any ideas there? Can you throw out a few? One more? Perfect. That's what Derek Hutchinson said when he designed his kayaks. He said, you know, the perfect length for a sea kayak? It's the length of your garage. Well, it depends how much space you've got, doesn't it? No. And how many types of how many types of kayak do you want? Well, if you have a surf kayak and a whitewater kayak for surfing and a sea kayak and maybe a sprint kayak, maybe a long distance racing kayak for marathon and maybe a back polo kayak, you're going to start adding up, and the space is the issue. So what does your partner think about it? Well, so coffee. Time for more coffee. I didn't really start drinking good coffee until I went to Iceland in 1977 and circumnavigated Iceland, and you'll see that in the book. Coffee in Iceland was excellent because Iceland bought some of the finest coffee that was available worldwide and imported it. They had some of the highest coffee consumption rates worldwide. And because of their buying power, even though it's a small nation, they actually sourced some of the best coffee. Every time we stopped and we wanted to camp somewhere, people would find us and they would drag us back up to their house. Come and have some coffee. And we go in and have coffee, and the coffee was always excellent. It was tasty, strong, hot, and usually accompanied by a whole meal. But the coffee was something that I took home in my head thinking, when I go home, I'm never going to give someone instant coffee, which is what I always used to drink back in England. Until then, I'm never going to give someone instant coffee if I invite them back for coffee. If they come into the house, I'm going to invite them, would you like a cup of coffee? I will grind it, brew it fresh, and deliver it. And that's what I started doing. From that day onwards, you can read more about that in this book, Iceland by Kayak. But if you come back to McGregor, it's the one on the right, he's the old guy. He always carried a little spirit stove, and the spirit stove would boil water. And he said that the best coffee that you can carry when you're doing a sea kayaking venture was, it's like this liquid concentrated coffee mix with chicory. And he said that was the best. The coffee essence was the thing that you needed. You get it in a little glass bottle, and he wrote about it a few times in his books. When he was on the continent, this is in Europe, you know, coming from the island of UK, the continent is like France, and Germany, and Holland, and places like that. He said you get much better coffee over there. They roast it fresh and they brew it fresh and they grind it fresh, and it always tastes way better than anything you can get in UK. I can believe that. I've had experience. Mac Foster, on the other hand, on the other side, he always carries one of these, a little double shot espresso maker. Stainless steel, because stainless steel doesn't corrode in salt water. And it brews a very good little espresso when you're traveling. However, there's not enough coffee in one of those. So maybe the answer is something a little bit larger. Maybe one that has enough for two people, and then you just do multiples. When you want another one, maybe you need to carry more than one coffee machine with you. And we just need one more option. or maybe something a little bit bigger. If you have a bigger one than that, you can travel in it. So I live in Seattle, and Seattle's up in the northwest, not so far north from Portland that you can't get up there if you walk for a few weeks. But coffee doesn't grow there. Where does coffee grow? Well, it sort of grows around this middle ground between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, spanning the equator. That's the zone where coffee will grow. If it's grown outside of there, it kind of gets too cold. The coffee gets frost on it, it got frost damage, and it dies. So it's not very good for Seattle. Indonesia is one of the places that grow coffee. The Dutch started planting plantations there and making the local people grow coffee and sugar for them, which they exported, and they were ruthless. Even if the people were starving, they couldn't grow their normal crops. They had to grow coffee and sugar. I was first invited to go to Indonesia by a Swedish company. Missoul is the island that we went to, and it's this Swede had gone adventuring all over the world and discovered this little place in Raja Ampat, and he said, it's a paradise. You'll love it. You have to come out and do some guest guiding for us. You have 3-week-long trips and 2-week-long trips and camping. But we have a support boat to carry all of the equipment. All you have to do is make sure that the customers are happy. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? In the Ice Age, that area was joined on to Australia. It was one landmass. And to the other side, there's another landmass which was joined on to Asia. So there's the Asian continent and the Australian continent. And Missoul was on the Australian continent. To the north, you had placental mammals. Things like tigers and elephants and baboons and orangutans and monkeys come on that continent over there. And on the other side, you have monotremes and what are the other ones? The marsupials. So it's wallabies and kangaroos and duck-billed platypuses and echidnas and odd little creatures like that. So totally different evolution of species on either side. And at about the time that McGregor was wandering around in his kayak in Europe, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a contemporary of Darwin, was coming up with a theory about the evolution of species. And he was in Indonesia, mostly on the Asian side, but he identified a line that ran up between the two sides, where the marsupials on the one side and the placental mammals on the other, and a little area in the middle where you got a little bit of both, where some species had managed to swim across or fly across. But basically, that deep water channel separated the species and stopped them from crossing over. Missoul was on the Australian side, and it's an idyllic landscape, waterscape, with lots of little islands, all made of limestone and covered in vegetation, with deep blue pools of clear water going down into the depths, surrounded by coral reefs covered in little tropical fish. The landscape is very steep and very prickly. You can't really climb up onto the tops of many of the islands because it's treacherous, too sharp and too dangerous. But occasionally you get a small sandy beach where you could camp if you have permission. If you don't have permission, then the guys with the machetes come round. And we did experience a little bit of that, but not much, because we had permission. You have parrots and hornbills, all sorts of things flying around, shrieking up in the foliage. Lots of orchids. The rock is, as I say, very sharp, And that's because the rainwater with a little bit of acidity from the carbon dioxide that's dissolves the limestone. And then it redeposits it as calcite somewhere else. So every edge is like a knife, like a little razor blade with little spikes, like needles. You wouldn't want to climb up one of these things. But where we camped, that was a different matter. Perfect little sandy beaches, string a hammock between the trees. We had mesh tents so the breeze could blow through. It's 85% humidity, 90-degree temperatures, and at night, everything hummed or scratched. We had holes surrounding us. And out of the holes at night came land crabs. And the land crabs would scratch around the tents and try and get in. And if you wanted to switch a light on to see them, they were everywhere. There were lots of holes. But those little things were no problem, really, because there was something else happening that needed bigger caves. And these ones ate coconuts, and they could open them with their big claw. And this little creature is a coconut crab, or a robber crab, as they're sometimes called. And one of its claws is much larger than the other, and it can actually shred a coconut. And I assume that if it decided in the middle of the night that your head looked like a coconut. So coconut crabs are also known as robber crabs, as Brigitte, our one-legged friend who came on one of the expeditions, found out. She left her bag, which was about that size, full of stuff that she valued, disappeared. And she was pretty angry with everybody until someone found it just outside a robber crab's lair. It was just a little bit too big to go through the hole. And it'd gone about 100 yards away. And so would have been on its way in, never to be seen again. So maybe you need a machete after all. This little guy here is called Prio. His name is Prio. He comes from Java. And we were sitting, looking out from our campground on this beautiful blue pool with these strange rocks sticking up on stalks in the background, the coral, and thinking, well, this is pretty nice. He said, I'd really like you to come and paddle on a lake with me. And I said, a lake? Yes, in Sumatra. I'd like to do some lake paddling. I'm organizing an expedition. And I'm thinking, you have in mind, I'm a sea kayaker, but I want to go and paddle on a lake when there's this sort of thing around. And he said, well, I think you would like it. We're going to go and study Batak culture. Batak culture? So the Batak are people who live around Lake Toba in Sumatra, in North Sumatra. And it was an Indonesian expedition with Indonesian people, sponsored by National Geographic Indonesia, to study Batak culture around Lake Toba. And it's a crater lake of a volcano. Now you have a crater lake in Oregon called Crater Lake. That's pretty aptly named, isn't it? Anyway, it's a crater that's about 5 miles across by 6 miles across. Okay, so yeah, you could do an expedition around there. And it's got an island in it called Wizard Island. I think it's Wizard Island, isn't it? Yeah. Well, Lake Toba is in Sumatra, which is about 1,700 miles west of Mysore, where we were before. And it's on the Asian side of the Wallace Line. And it's a crater lake with a big island in it. And the lake is 60 miles long by 18 miles wide. It's the biggest caldera lake in the world. And it's caused by a volcano that erupted, a super volcano that erupted 74,000 years ago and buried India in up to 20 inches of ash. Left a big hole. The lake is about elevation of about 2,000 feet with a water surface, but the crater, the sides of the crater go up another 4,000 feet. The Batak people built houses like this on stilts. They didn't use nails. Everything is mortised together. The entrances are usually through a trapdoor, so they're easily defended. You go up a ladder to a trapdoor, and there's one room in there. And there will be several families living in the same room, relatives. And in the back right-hand corner, there was usually a big carved chest containing the king or the chief's prized possessions, which included things like fabrics. The fabrics that they wove were beautiful, and they were woven on backstrap looms, these little looms for the women sitting on the ground, a little bit in manner of someone sitting in a kayak, but your feet on a footrest, you've got a little back support behind you that you can push, and they'd weave these wonderful batiks. So they were used in ceremonies like births and deaths and marriages and things like that. And often daily, you know, a lot of the women would just wear a cloth around the head and carry things on their head. But really fascinating culture around the lake there. Fishing in dugout canoes, nowadays using nets, mostly for tilapia and carp, also for some crayfish that were introduced, Australian crayfish. And these little things, they're about as tippy as a log. Not so easy to paddle. Now, is that a canoe or a kayak? But everywhere we went, the farmers had a small number of coffee plants. And the coffee comes like that. That's where your coffee comes from. It comes from little berries that look like cherries and are actually called coffee cherries. And each cherry, when you split it apart and get the fleshy bit off, it's got a little parchment envelope inside. And inside each envelope are 2 seeds. And those are the coffee beans. And those coffee beans are processed, they're roasted in coffee roasteries, and they come out as the coffee beans that you grind to make your coffee. Every coffee bean there is picked by hand, and the crop doesn't sort of ripen all together, it ripens year round. There's always some coffee beans ripening, and they pick them and they ship them off to coffee roastery, and they're processed. And then when they add the milk from water buffalo, you wouldn't want to get the milk from that one, but from the cows, you get some really creamy, rich, creamy lattes. If anyone's interested in that kind of coffee. So that's Lake Toba. And if you're interested in that kind of stuff, there's a book over there for sale in the corner there with Kristen that's called Heart of Toba. Heart of Toba is the name of the island. It's not Wizard Island, it's Heart of Toba, the island in the middle of Lake Toba. And that's what I named my book. And one of the creatures that you find there is the Asian palm civet. It looks a bit like a raccoon or a weasel, and it eats lizards and frogs and insects and things like that. And it also eats coffee beans, but only the ripest, finest coffee beans. So you might think they're a bit of a pest. There you are, you're wanting them to ripen and you're wanting the best ones, and it's going to get eaten by one of these things. The Dutch planted the coffee. The Dutch made the local people produce the coffee, pick it, and basically they were the slave labor for the Dutch who exported coffee since the 1600s. And they wouldn't let the farmers use the coffee for their own use. So they decided they were going to do something else. And they found that coffee beans aren't digested by palm civets. When they poop them out, they're already germinating and they will grow in the forest, in the wild. So they're spreading coffee. But if they sifted through the civet poop, they could collect the coffee beans and make their own coffee. And they didn't get into trouble with the Dutch. I'm serious. So our friend Barb, she went to Indonesia to do some diving. And she went diving somewhere close to where we've been kayaking. And so she was thinking about us when she was there. And very thoughtfully, she dived into the little store at the airport on the way home, thinking, well, I've got to get something for Kristen and Nigel to bring back. There's something that looks like chocolate. That looks good. I'll get that little package and give it to them. And when she gave it to us, we burst out laughing. And she said, why are you laughing? It's coffee made from coffee beans that have been eaten by a civet, palm civet, pooped out, cleaned, I hope, and made into coffee. She was mortified. So do you want to know what it tastes like? Tastes really good. Kopi Luwak. You see it on the market. Kopi Luwak is actually quite expensive, and it is really good, but that's where it comes from. So the Dutch brought their coffee back to the Netherlands, which is there in Europe on the map. And just a little bit north of there is Denmark. And in Denmark, they have colonies too. Actually, the Dutch don't have colonies in Indonesia anymore because Indonesia is independent now. But Greenland is still under Danish sovereignty. If anyone needs another beer, just one more, please go and get one. Because, you know, I have one here and they're actually quite good. Also, we'll gladly serve them for you. So Greenland is really the origin of kayaks. And Sven Dahlstrup, as a Danish guy, was one of many Danes who go out to Greenland to study Greenland techniques. And he went out there to find out how kayaks are built by Greenland hunters, what the dimensions should be and that sort of thing, how you put the skins on, how you bend the timbers. And he came back to Denmark and started giving classes in how to build Greenland-style kayaks. And that spread across to UK, and then that spread across to the United States. So he's one of the people who started popularizing Greenland-style kayaks. Of course, in Denmark, there's no shortage of craftsmen making Greenland paddles. In a place called or something like that, I get criticized every time I try to say the word, but it's, you put a mouthful of pebbles and you try to say something, it sounds a bit like that. There's a little guy who was on one of my kayaking classes And his house has a doormat that says Fender. And he's got a stack of paddles up against the corner. So obviously he plays the Greenland guitar or something like that. At the back of his house is a small workshop, and it is stacked full of, well, guitars. And most of them are being repaired, or they could be guitars that he's built, or maybe they're guitars that have just been forgotten about. But the last 50 years, he's been crafting classical guitars. So what better? Classical guitars. Nylon strings, classical guitars, except for some guy called Stig Peterson. And has anyone heard of Disneyland After Dark? Disneyland After Dark? No, they had to change the name because of Disney. Disney didn't like them using it. So they called themselves DAD. Dad, but it's got a dot between each one. So DAD is a Danish, well, it was I don't know what they called themselves, a cowpunk band or something. They called themselves something different. From the 1980s, they were playing on stage, and Stig used to go to Dennis and say, well, you know, look, see, I've drawn this thing. I've got this piece of paper. Look, this is my idea for my next guitar. Can you build this? And Dennis would look at it and he'd turn me a page. Yeah, I'll give it a try. And then he's still trying to figure out how on earth to build this guitar. And Stig will be there. Have you done it yet? Have you done it yet? So one of the guitars that Stig asked him to build was shaped like a rocket. It had a cutaway so he could still play it. And it had capacity for a little bit of pyrotechnics. And Stig liked to have a helmet on with a visor, and he'd have fireworks strapped to his head so that the flames would come out of his head while he was playing. And sometimes he'd have the fires coming out of the back of the rocket as well. And another guitar was shaped like this with an aircraft at one end. And another one was like a reverse guitar. The head was like the body, and the body was like the head. Another one was like an iPhone, a giant iPhone, and it would live stream the audience while it was playing. It's a two-string, yes, good eye, two-string bass guitar. You'll read about a few other two-string ideas in just one more book. Mostly Dennis was playing, or he was crafting or mending things that had more strings than that, like this little mandolin. 1996, there I was, somewhere cold, thinking winter is upon me, and now what am I going to do? And my publisher called me and said, would you like to be somewhere warm this winter? And I said to her, well, maybe. What do you have in mind? She said, you go to Florida a lot to teach, don't you? I said, yes. She said, well, we're starting a new series of guidebooks. And we're starting with Alaska and Florida. And we thought we'd got somebody to do the Florida thing, but they dropped out, and we thought of you. So I thought, okay. So I went down to Florida, and I borrowed a kayak from Sweetwater Kayaks from my friend Scott. And Sweetwater Kayaks at that time was in Siesta Key, Florida, which is where Scott lived. And with Kristen's help, I bought a small American car, a Cadillac Coupe de Ville for $500, and a roof rack. And in the same day, I took my driving test twice, passed it on the second one. First time I didn't know the rules about alcohol. Got it insured, went back through a thunderstorm, and I was now the proud owner of the Motel Coupe de Ville, which was my motel for that winter, driving around southern Florida, mapping out different trips, taking pictures of birds with spoonbills, roseate spoonbills, manatees, and sitting on logs to have my lunch.
Oh, not that one.
Finding little armadillos. And sunning myself on crowded beaches. The kayak is 18 feet long. Everything I owned could fit in the trunk. I could sleep in the back, and that was home for that winter. And that was also where I met this guy on the right, Russell Farrow, and his girlfriend, Claudia. And Russell was a musician. He played in bands, and he dealt in vintage guitars. And he was very knowledgeable about them. But he said, you know, the music industry is kind of tough. I want to have something a little bit more healthy. I've got a couple of business partners, and we're going to try and buy Sweetwater kayaks. And he did. He bought it, and then moved it across to the other side of Tampa Bay. And for years, every time I met Russell, we pulled out the guitars and we played guitar. So how long have you been playing the guitar? Well, I've been playing guitar for about as long as I've been kayaking. Started off with some flamenco lessons, trying to learn how to do that, which in a way was good and in a way was bad, because I never learned how to read music. I learned how to hear it and how to interpret it and then to play it. And I managed to indoctrinate my younger brother and my sister into also playing guitar. So whenever I meet them, I'm always pulling out the guitars and playing guitar. So I always played acoustic guitars. I started off with nylon string guitars and then graduated to steel strings. But Mac Farrow, he played a lot of electric guitars, and all his band work was with electrics. So maybe another opportunity for more guitars. So I asked him, well, if you're getting an electric guitar, what's the most important thing about it? And he said, well, it's the tone wood. If the wood sounds good when you're playing it, then it's going to sound awesome when it's plugged in. So he always played the guitars unplugged to see what they were like every time before he evaluated them, before he plugged them in and played them on stage. So how many, oh yeah, you've got it. How many guitars do you need? One more. How many do you want?
Two more.
Two more. How much room do you have?
No.
What does your partner say? Oh, well, it didn't really matter for Russell. He collected guitars. When he was dealing in vintage guitars, he stashed away a few. Some of them were worth tens of thousands of dollars. And he had a little music room about the size of my kitchen. And you couldn't get into it without moving things aside. It was stacked high with guitar cases full of guitars. And there'd be all these valve amps and vintage amps. Every time I went down there, he would pull out a stash of guitars, handing them out to me across the guitar cases and saying, okay, and we'll take this one, and we'll take this one, and then we'd plug them in and we'd play, and he collected guitars and kayaks, and he drank a lot of espressos, and I ask a lot of questions and I collect stories. So the collection stuff we had in common, the guitar stuff, the kayaks, the canoes, we had a lot in common. Unfortunately, he died before he could cash in his inheritance of all his guitars. But my burning question is, why would you stop at just one more? You said two. Why would you stop at two more? But maybe just, why not one more? I have to thank you all for coming here tonight, because including the people that I can't see because you're on Zoom, but I appreciate you being there too. It's a lovely evening out, and I really do appreciate you being here. Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate you setting all this up so that it works. Now, has anybody got any questions?
You have a guitar with you?
I do not have a guitar with me, sadly.
So when you started, for the picture, the cover of your book said there were many guitars that got burned.
There are many.
The guitars that were burned.
Actually, yes. But the story is in the book, but this was the story about my luthier friends in Seattle who I met canoeing on Green Lake, and the man and wife, both luthiers, one repaired guitars and Rick built guitars, really both very top-notch guitars, expensive guitars. Cat used to make repairs on guitars, and you wouldn't see what was repaired. You couldn't. It was just beautiful. But people used to go into their workshop and say, you know, can you repair this? And she'd take one look at it, and she'd say, throw it in the bin, go down the road, buy yourself a new one, spend your money, don't waste it on this, no, I'm not repairing it. Buy yourself a new one because you get something way better. This will never be a good guitar. She was very honest and very brutal. But sometimes people literally did throw them in the bin rather than nail them to the wall. And at the end of every season, they had guitars and broken bits of endangered species of timber that they couldn't use, that were just cluttering up the workshop. So they had a party every year and invited all the other luthiers, Seattle, down to Golden Gardens to sunset. And as soon as the sun came over the horizon, down over the horizon, disappeared behind the mountains, they'd light the fire, and all these guitars would go up in smoke. Anyway, that's the short story. Any other questions? Sorry? Yeah.
What happened with the guitars?
His brother, who was the one who inherited, took them to the local store and said, sell these. So they went out to the wind. Who knows where they went? I think there were a lot of Russell's friends who would have given their eye teeth to have something that he'd had. A lot of those guitars were very special. So I don't know where they are now.
I have a question from the chat, if you could repeat it. What is your favorite coffee drink?
What is my favorite coffee drink? I usually drink, I have a double shot of espresso with about an equal amount of water normally, about 25 times a day. So I would say probably that's my favorite because I drink it more than anything else. But, you know, I'm not averse to other kinds. I had a latte today. Sumatran coffee. Yeah,
So you mentioned somebody you knew well who had studied Greenland kayaking and the kind of paddles, etc. Well, a number of years ago, there was some commentary on Luke's listserv about the proper shape of a Greenland paddle, which have shoulders and not shoulders. So it's went on for a little while. And then somebody posted a picture of actual Greenland paddles, and they were just amazingly varied, including one that was actually just two hand paddles. That were actually used in Greenland. So I just was curious what your thoughts were about how consistent the style is versus how varied the style is.
Well,
Repeat that if you can.
I can repeat that. There are an awful lot of different Greenland style kayaks, Greenland style paddles available from Greenland. Very, very varied. So what is the ideal standard Greenland paddle? And the ideal Greenland paddle, actually, I believe, is the one that suits you. And as many people as there are paddling, that's the number of different styles that you should have. If you could do that for kayaks too, I think it works for kayaks, but it's a little bit harder to achieve. But it's a matter of what do you want. So every Greenland paddler in Greenland or elsewhere is going to want something slightly different dimensions, slightly different ideas. Maybe their hands want to be a little bit wider apart or closer or whatever. So there isn't really a standard. But there are some options. You know, if you want to get a starting point, there are a few basic options.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
You ever take a guitar with you kayak?
Once. Are you? Did you ever take a kayak paddling with you? And I said once. And it was a small trip. We paddled down the Grand Canyon and in a surf kayak. And I took the fins out. But we had some rafts. It was a friend of ours from across the street got a permit, and he'd waited for 11 years to get it. And he wandered across and called down, "Nigel, you down there?" I said, "Yeah, what is it?" He said, "Well, do you ever do any whitewater kayaking?" And I said, "Well, since I've been in the United States, I'm lucky if I get the opportunity to do it once a year." And he said, and I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I just got a permit to paddle the Grand Canyon and wondered whether you could do rescue, you and Kristen." So it turned out that they got 7 rafts, 2 people to a raft, plus Kristen and me who paddled kayaks. And everything we needed to carry could be carried by rafts. And they said the more the better, because the heavier the rafts are, the easier they are to manage. "How many beers do you drink a night?" I said, "What?" I was thinking, well, how many beers could I fit in the back of my surf kayak just for a 3-week-long trip? And well, anyway, they had a girl who ran the Red Hook bar in Seattle for the brewery, and she was coming along, and she was bringing kegs of beer. They just wanted to know how many kegs of beer they should bring. So anyway, yeah, so we had plenty of beer. And it was icy cold because the river was icy cold. But I took a guitar and I put it on the raft. It was a Martin backpacker guitar, you know, so it's a little one. And so I had a guitar all the way down on that kayak trip. But I didn't have to carry it.
Did it survive well?
Yeah.
Huh?
Yep, no problems at all.
And another chat question, have you met Joe Greenlee of Redfish Kayaks in Port Townsend?
Joe Green, Redfish Kayaks, I probably have because I know Redfish Kayaks. And I'm just trying to picture the person. Why?
And Jeff and Peggy just asked that question.
So tell them hello. They will hear me. Hello, hello. And thank you for joining in on this. Are you up in Port Townsend now?
Well, actually, it was not him. It was somebody else who asked if you knew him. So I don't know if he's on here.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, may I just say afterwards, Kristen, who is over here, just standing up, she drove me down here today and she is manning this little table over in the corner here. We have copies of Just One More, the book, plus some other books that are already published, plus one that you can't buy yet because it's not going to be published until August or September, and it's ready and you can thumb through it, which is called What is the Color of Water? And if you would like to buy books, I'll be very, very happy. That would help us enormously. And yeah, just thank you for coming again.